The silence in the grand dining hall of Station 55 was not the kind of silence born of peace. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of exclusion. Captain Stephen Thomas, a man whose very skin bore the map of 1,000 sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, a solitary figure in a room designed for brotherhood. At 58 years old, Stephen was a living legend in the state of Colorado, a firefighter who had pulled more souls from the grip of death than anyone cared to count. But he was also a man who had paid a price so steep that it had left him bankrupt of human connection. The right side of his face from his jawline up to his hairline was a landscape of rippled, healed, burned tissue, a permanent souvenir from the chemical plant explosion of '98 that had taken his rookie partner and nearly claimed him as well. While the rest of the crew, a younger generation of energetic men and women, laughed and clattered their silverware at the other end of the mess hall. Stephen ate, with his back slightly turned to them, a defensive wall built, not out of malice but out of a bone-deep exhaustion from seeing people avert their eyes. He wasn't technically active duty anymore. The department had kept him on as the station's logistics manager and safety officer, a role created specifically to honor his service without putting him back on the front lines. He lived in a small, renovated apartment above the station's garage, a ghost haunting the machinery he used to command every evening at 6 p.m. While the active crew cooked their communal meals filled with banter and inside jokes, Stephen would heat up his simple Tupperware of beef stew or chili, sit at the very edge of the communal table, the dead man's corner, as he jokingly called it in his mind, dandied in silence. The younger firefighters respected him, certainly, but they feared him too. They didn't know how to talk to a man who looked like he had walked through hell and decided to stay there. The air around him felt charged with a history they couldn't comprehend, so they left him alone, convincing themselves it was what the old captain wanted. But the routine of Station 55 was about to be shattered, not by an alarm or a catastrophe, but by a sleek black limousine that pulled into the station's visitor lot on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The car belonged to Jason Sanchez, a tech mogul whose software empire had bought him half the city, including the land the fire station sat on. Sanchez was a donor, a man whose name was on the plaque by the front door, but he was rarely seen in person. On this day, however, the limousine didn't deposit the billionaire. Instead, the driver opened the rear door to reveal a small, pale girl of about 7 years old, clutching a leather-bound sketchbook against a coat that cost more than Stephen made in a month. This was Jessica Sanchez. Her father was currently in a high-stakes merger in Singapore, and her mother was finding herself at a retreat in Seattle. The station had been designated as a safe drop-off point for an hour, while her nanny handled a visa emergency at the consulate downtown. It was an irregular arrangement, bought and paid for by a substantial donation to the Widows and Orphans Fund. The station commander, Chief Frank Campbell, was flustered, ordering the crew to be on their best behavior, to show the girl the trucks, to keep her entertained. But Jessica had no interest in the shiny red engines or the sliding poles. She was a child who had grown up in sterile penthouses and silent hotel rooms. She possessed a solemnity that felt unnatural for her age. While the firefighters tried to dazzle her with sirens and lights, Jessica wandered away, her patent leather shoes clicking softly on the concrete floor. She drifted through the hallways, ignoring the attempts of the rookie firefighters to hand her plastic helmets, until she found herself at the threshold of the mess hall. It was just past 6 p.m. The room was dimly lit, save for the pool of light at the far end of the table where Stephen Thomas sat, hunched over his bowl of stew. Stephen heard the footsteps, but didn't turn around. He assumed it was one of the rookies coming to grab a soda from the vending machine. He continued to eat, the spoon scraping the bottom of the bowl, the only sound in the vast room. He was lost in his own thoughts, thinking about the anniversary of the fire that was coming up next week, the phantom pain in his scarred skin flaring up with the damp weather. He felt the weight of his isolation more acute than usual today. It was a physical pressure in his chest, a reminder that while he had saved many lives, he had somehow lost his own in the process. He was the phantom of the firehouse, a relic to be preserved but not touched. Suddenly, the scraping of a heavy wooden chair against the linoleum floor tore through the silence. It was a loud, jarring noise that made Stephen flinch. He turned his head slowly, instinctively keeping his scarred side in the shadows, expecting to see a janitor, or perhaps the chief. Instead, he looked down to see a tiny figure struggling to climb onto the chair directly across from him. Jessica Sanchez hoisted herself up, arranged her coat neatly around her, and placed her sketchbook on the table. She didn't look at the empty chairs at the other end of the room where the laughter of the crew usually echoed. She looked straight at Stephen. For a moment, the old firefighter froze. He was used to children crying when they saw his face, or staring with open-mouthed horror. He was used to adults quickly pulling their kids away, whispering apologies that hung in the air like smoke. But this girl did neither. She looked at him with a gaze that was analytical, almost piercing. Her eyes a startling shade of intelligent gray. "You're eating alone," she stated. It wasn't a question. It was an observation, delivered with the flat effect of a judge reading a verdict. Stephen blinked, his scarred hand hovering over a spoon. He cleared his throat, a sound like gravel grinding together. "I prefer the quiet, little lady," Stephen rasped, his voice rough from years of inhaling toxins. "You shouldn't be back here. The tour is out front." "I don't like tours," Jessica replied, opening her sketchbook to a blank page. She picked up a charcoal pencil. "And I don't think you prefer the quiet. My father says he prefers the quiet, but he just uses it to hide from people asking him for money. You don't look like you have money, so you must be hiding from something else." Stephen was so taken aback by the girl's bluntness that he forgot to be self-conscious. He turned fully toward her, the light from the overhead lamp illuminating the ruined half of his face. He waited for the recoil, the gasp. Jessica merely tilted her head to the side, studying the ridges of his skin as if they were interesting textures on a leaf. "I'm hiding from people who Stephen said, a hint of a challenge in his tone. "Most kids run away when they see me. Why aren't you running?" Jessica began to sketch, her hand moving fluidly across the paper. "I've seen scary things," she murmured, her focus on the page. "My nanny makes me watch the news, so I know how dangerous the world is." "Your face isn't scary, it looks like a map," Stephen asked, leaning forward slightly, his stew forgotten. "Yes, the map is somewhere that burned down, but is still standing." She stopped drawing and looked up, locking eyes with him again. Then she asked the question. It wasn't about the fire. It wasn't about the pain. It was a question that cut through 20 years of armor and exposed the raw heart beating beneath his uniform. "Mr. Fireman," she said softly, "my mom says the people who eat alone are either very important kings or very bad criminals. But you look sad, not bad. So ... Are you in a timeout? Did you do something wrong that no one has forgiven you for?" The air in the room seemed to vanish. Stephen felt a lump form in his throat, hard and painful. "Are you in a timeout?" The innocence of the phrasing shattered him. For 2 decades, he had punished himself for surviving when his partner hadn't. He had sentenced himself to this solitary confinement. Convinced that his survival was a crime and his scars were the brand of his guilt, he realized, with a sudden, terrifying clarity, that this 7-year-old stranger had seen the truth he had hidden from everyone, even himself. He wasn't eating alone because of the scars on his face. He was eating alone because he didn't believe he deserved a seat at the table. Stephen opened his mouth to answer, but his voice failed him. He looked at the girl, this small, abandoned princess in a tower of wealth, and saw a reflection of his own loneliness. Before he could compose himself, the heavy double doors of the mess hall swung open. A sharp, high-pitched voice echoed off the walls. "Jessica, good heavens. Child, what are you doing in this? ... double quotes. It was the nanny. "Mrs. Anderson." "Helen." A woman who looked as though she had been starched stiff. She marched into the room, her heels clicking like gunshots. She took one look at Stephen and recoiled visibly, her hand flying to her pearl necklace. "Oh, my word," she gasped, stepping between Jessica and the captain as if shielding the girl from a contagious disease. "Come away immediately, Jessica. You shouldn't be bothering the help." She trailed off, waving a hand vaguely at Stephen's face. Jessica closed her sketchbook with a snap. "He's not the help, Mrs. Anderson. He's a captain." "We are leaving," Mrs. Anderson hissed, grabbing Jessica by the upper arm. "Your father would be furious if he knew you were back here unsupervised with ... double quotes." As she was dragged away, Jessica looked back over her shoulder. Her eyes met Stephen's one last time. "You didn't answer my question," she called out. "I'll be back tomorrow." Stephen sat frozen as the doors swung shut, leaving him alone in the silence once again. But this Chimie, the silence felt different. It wasn't empty. It was filled with the echo of a question that demanded an answer. He looked down at his cold stew and realized he had lost his appetite. Not from sadness, but from a sudden, unfamiliar surge of hope. He wasn't sure how, but he knew the girl meant what she said. She would be back. And for the first time in years, Stephen Thomas was afraid not of the fire, but of the possibility that someone wanted to walk through the flames to sit beside him. The next day at Station 55 began with a tension that hummed beneath the usual noise of hydraulic checks and morning drills. The younger firefighters exchanged confused glances when they saw Captain Stephen Thomas emerge from his apartment. He was freshly shaven, the stubble that usually shadowed the unscarred side of his jaw gone, and his uniform shirt was pressed with a sharpness that hadn't been seen in years. He moved with a restless energy, checking the clock on the wall every 10 minutes, his eyes darting toward the visitor entrance. The crew whispered among themselves, wondering if the old man finally had a medical appointment he was nervous about, or perhaps a meeting with the union reps. None of them guessed that a 58-year-old veteran of the Flames was terrified of a 7-year-old girl's return. Stephen told himself it was ridiculous. She was a child of caprice, a wealthy tourist in his gritty world. She had likely forgotten him the moment the limousine door closed. But when the clock struck 4 p.m., the familiar hum of a heavy engine purred in the lot. It wasn't the limousine this time, but a sleek, chauffeured SUV. The driver, looking bored, escorted Jessica to the door and handed her off to the front desk, muttering something about the nanny having a migraine. Jessica walked in, clutching her sketchbook like a shield, wearing a yellow raincoat that made her look like a small beacon in the gray industrial garage. She didn't wander today. She marched with purpose, navigating the labyrinth of hoses and gear racks straight to the mess hall. Stephen was there, pretending to read an inventory report on foam. He heard her small footsteps stop beside him. He lowered the clipboard and looked down. Jessica didn't say hello. She simply pulled out the heavy wooden chair, the legs screeching against the floor, a sound that was becoming music to Stephen's ears, and climbed up. She placed a small silver thermos on the table. "I brought hot chocolate," she announced, her voice echoing in the empty hall. "It's imported from Switzerland. My dad says it's the best, but it tastes like melted money." Stephen felt the corner of his mouth, the one that still worked properly, twitch upward. "Station coffee tastes like burnt rubber and regret, kid." "You promised an answer," Jessica reminded him, opening her book to the page where she had drawn him the day before. The charcoal sketch was rough, but shockingly emotional. She had captured the sorrow in his eyes perfectly. Skyving sighed, leaning back in his chair. The defensive walls he had spent 2 decades reinforcing were crumbling under the weight of her expectant gaze. "I'm not in a timeout," he began, his voice gravelly and low. "And I didn't do something bad, but a long time ago, I was in a fire that took my best friend. I lived, and he didn't. When I looked in the mirror afterward, I saw a monster. I figured if I looked like a monster, I should probably hide like one." Jessica processed this, her gray eyes unblinking. She didn't offer pity. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a red crayon. She leaned over a drawing and began to color the scarred side of Stephen S.'s face she had sketched. "Fire is red," she murmured. "But red is also the color of superheroes and hearts, and stop signs that keep people safe. You aren't hiding because you're a monster, Stephen. You're hiding because you're sad." The afternoon marked the beginning of the most unlikely alliance Station 55 had ever seen. For the next 3 weeks, Jessica became a fixture in the late afternoons. It turned out her parents' business trips were extended affairs, and the nanny, Mrs. Anderson, was all too happy to dump her charge at the safe haven of the fire station so she could pursue her own interests. The isolation of the dead man's corner began to dissolve. At first, it was just the two of them. Jessica would draw, and Stephen would tell her stories, not the horrific ones, but the funny ones. He told her about the time the crew had to rescue a cat that was actually a raccoon, or the time the rookie glued his helmet to the locker. For the first time in 20 years, the sound of Stephen Thomas's laughter, rusty and creaky, was heard in the mess hall. The change in the captain was palpable. He stood taller. He stopped turning his face away when people spoke to him. The crew, initially bewildered, began to drift toward that end of the table. It started with Lieutenant Miller, David G. Miller, bringing over a plate of cookies for the kid, then the rookies showing Jessica card tricks. Slowly, the invisible barrier Stephen had erected around himself evaporated. He wasn't just the scar anymore. He was the guy who knew how to make the quiet little rich girl laugh. Jessica was starving for connection, for the roof-and-tumble reality of a life that wasn't wrapped in plastic and velvet. In Stephen, she found a father figure who actually listened. In Jessica, Stephen found a reason to forgive himself for surviving. But the world outside the station walls was not as forgiving, and the bubble of peace they had created was fragile. The turning point came on a Tuesday, exactly 1 month after their first meeting. It was Stephen's 59th birthday. He hadn't mentioned it, of course, but the station calendar had it marked. She wanted to give him something special. She didn't have money of her own, but she had access to a house filled with things that nobody touched. That afternoon, Jessica arrived with a small velvet box in her pocket. She was practically vibrating with excitement. When she sat down at the table, Now joined by two other firefighters who were helping her with her math homework, she slid the box towards Stephen. "Happy birthday, Captain," she beamed. Stephen opened the box and froze. Inside sat a pair of vintage diamond cufflinks, heavy and glittering under the fluorescent lights. They were worth more than his pension. Panic spiked in his chest. "Jessica," he whispered, closing the lid quickly. "They were in my dad's drawer," she shrugged casually. "He has 1,000,000 of them. He never wears these. I thought they looked like little stars." "Honey, you can't just take these. This is ... This is stealing," Stephen said gently, pushing the box back. Jessica insisted, her lower lip trembling. "He's never home." Before Stephen could explain why he couldn't accept stolen diamonds, the station's main bay doors opened with a mechanical whine, admitting a gust of rain and a woman who looked like a storm cloud given human form. It wasn't the nanny. It was a woman in a tailored Chanel suit, shaking a wet umbrella with aggressive disdain. This was Cynthia Sanchez, Jason's sister, and Jessica's aunt. She had arrived in town to check on the estate and had found the nanny absent and the child missing. Tracking her phone had led her to this public utility garage, and she was Cynthia marched into the mess hall, her eyes scanning the room with laser-like judgment. When she spotted Jessica sitting next to the scarred, rugged man, surrounded by half-a-tin chili bowls, her face contorted in horror. Cynthia's voice shattered the warm atmosphere like glass. "Get away from that, ... double quotes." Jessica jumped, the velvet box clattering to the floor. The cufflinks spilled out, tumbling across the linoleum like accusations. Cynthia's eyes widened as she recognized the family heirlooms. She lunged forward, not to grab her niece, but to snatch up the diamonds. "My brother's cufflinks," she hissed, straightening up and pointing a manicured finger directly at Stephen's ruined face. I knew letting you come to this place was a mistake." The room went dead, silent. The other firefighters stood up, their chairs scraping loudly, ready to defend their captain. "Ma'am, you need to calm down," Lieutenant Miller started, stepping forward. Cynthia shrieked, clutching the diamonds to her chest. "I walk in here and find my 7-year-old niece sitting with a disfigured brute, giving away thousands of dollars in jewelry. What have you been telling her?" Stephen stood up slowly, his hands raised in a placating gesture, though his heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The old shame, the feeling of being a monster, came rushing back, suffocating him. "Ma'am, she brought them as a gift. I was just telling her to take them back." "He didn't." "Save it for the police," Cynthia spat, grabbing Jessica's arm with a grip that made the girl wince. Jessica began to cry, struggling against her aunt's hold. "No, he didn't take them. I gave them to him." Jessica screamed, her little legs kicking. Cynthia laughed, a cruel, cold sound. "Look at him, Jessica. People like him aren't friends with people like us. He's using you." She dragged the weeping girl toward the exit. Stephen took a step forward, his instinct to protect the child overriding his fear. "She's hurting. Let her walk," he growled, his voice dropping to that command tone that used to order men into burning buildings. Cynthia stopped and turned, her eyes filled with a classist disgust that cut deeper than any burn. "Stay back," she warned, "or I will have this entire station shut down for harboring a predator. You are a monster." With that, she dragged Jessica out into the rain. The heavy doors slammed shut, leaving a silence far worse than the one Stephen had lived in 4 years. This was the silence of judgment. He felt the eyes of his crew on him, not in suspicion, but in pity, which was almost worse. The velvet box lay empty on the floor. Stephen sank back into his chair, the dead man's corner suddenly feeling like a coffin. He had touched the sun, and now, as he had always feared, he was burning for it. The following 48 hours were a blur of gray misery for Stephen Thomas. The fire station, usually a place of chaotic energy and loud camaraderie, had fallen into a hush that felt like a wake. The crew moved around him on tiptoes, casting sympathetic glances that burned Stephen's pride more than his scars ever had. He had spent the last 2 decades making himself invisible to protect the station from his monster status, and in one afternoon, he had brought a hurricane of scandal to their doorstep. The threat of a lawsuit from the Sanchez family hung over the department like a guillotine. Chief Campbell had been called into meetings with the city council, and though he promised to fight for Stephen, the old captain knew how politics worked. A disfigured man accused of manipulating a billionaire as daughter was a PR nightmare the city would unwant to touch. By Thursday evening, Stephen had made up his mind. He sat in a small apartment above the garage, packing a battered duffel bag. He wouldn't wait to be fired. He wouldn't wait for the police to come asking questions about his relationship with Jessica. He would leave. He would disappear back into the smoke, find a cabin in the mountains, and embrace the isolation he should never have abandoned. He folded his dress uniform, his fingers lingering on the brass buttons, when a heavy knock rattled his door. He assumed it was the chief coming to deliver the bad news. "I'm going, Campbell," Stephen called out, his voice hoarse. But when the door opened, it wasn't Chief Campbell. It was a man in a bespoke charcoal suit, looking exhausted, disheveled, and terrifyingly powerful. It was Jason Sanchez, and he wasn't alone. Standing behind him, looking sheepish and pale, was the station commander. Mr. Jason asked. His voice wasn't the booming thunder of a titan of industry. It was quiet, strained. Stephen stiffened, his instincts screaming that this was the end. "If you're here to serve papers, you can leave them on the table." Jason stepped inside, ignoring the dismissal. He looked around the small, sparse apartment, a single bed, the framed photo of the crew from 1998, the total lack of luxury. In his hand, he held the leather-bound sketchbook that Jessica carried everywhere. "I'm not here to serve papers," Jason said, placing the book on the small kitchen counter. "I'm here because my daughter hasn't eaten in 2 days. Stephen flinched, his jaw tightening. "Sir, I never asked her for anything. I tried to give them back immediately. I would never." "I know," Jason interrupted, holding up a hand. "I know because I did what Cynthia didn't do. I looked at the evidence." He tapped the cover of the sketchbook. Stephen shook his head. "Drawings?" Jason opened the book. He flipped past pages of lonely stick figure drawings of a little girl in a big empty house. He stopped at the middle of the book. The drawings changed. There was color. There was a dining table. There was a man with a red face, drawn not as a monster, but as a giant with a shield. There were captions in shaky second-grade handwriting, the captain's chili, 5 stars, the map of the fire. "My friend Stephen." "My sister sees a scar and sees a villain," Jason said, his voice thickening with emotion. "She sees a man with no money and assumes he wants ours. But Jessica ... Jessica sees souls. I went through every page, Mr. Thomas. She didn't draw a thief." Jason looked up, his eyes rimmed with red